students, and welcome back to another lecture for Sexualities and Social Issues. Today, we're going to talk about learning about sex. Yes, that's right, the birds and the bees talk. Which is a great name for this talk, because the way that we learn about sex has nothing to do very often with sex itself, much the same way that birds and bees have nothing to do with sex itself. The way we learn about sex, especially in modern America, is very complicated and has a lot to do with where you are and when you are, what kind of technology you have, what kind of parents you have, and it can be a very complicated process. A lot of us continue to learn well into adulthood. So today, we're going to talk about different kinds of sources that you might have used to learn about sex and whether they were accurate or helpful. And we're also going to talk about the state of sex education in modern America. So, let's get started. So for a lot of people, their first source of information about sex is their parents. And this makes sense. Your parents are the first source of information about all sorts of things. But it's sort of a famously awkward conversation. You've probably heard people joke about the talk, which is what we call it when your parents sit you down and tell you things about sex that you probably already know and nobody involved wants to have the conversation. So this is kind of an old school way of learning about sex, and it does depend on your parents. Did they start to talk to you about sex early? Did they forget to talk to you about sex until you were leaving for college? Did they tell you the truth? Did they let you ask questions? And it's kind of a difficult position to put parents in, because very often they don't know the answers themselves. And so often what happens is it's just super awkward and everybody hates it and everybody goes home having learned nothing. So if you have had the talk with your parents, it probably went one of two ways. One is that you just hated the whole experience, and the other is that you already knew a lot of what your parents were trying to tell you, probably because of the internet. In this day and age, a lot of people educate themselves about sex and sexuality, and they often do so at a pretty young age. So the possibility that you had a super awkward talk is high, but it's also possible that your talk was cut short because, as it turns out, you were already familiar. A lot of parents use books, and this can be super helpful because the books contain the kind of facts that children need, it answers the kind of questions that children ask, and it also removes the parent from the situation so that the parent doesn't have to be the one sharing the really awkward information. So there are some excellent books out there in case you have children or you're responsible for any children, and some of them are aimed at the parents in terms of what you should talk about, and some of them are aimed at the kids themselves. So books are a really good place to start if you find the whole thing just too overwhelming. There are a few questions that I think are important to consider when we think about having the talk with kids. Eventually, it may turn out that you have to have the talk, so here are some things that I think are worth thinking about. Number one, what all should be included? Most of the time, when you have the sex talk with children, their primary concern is where babies come from, and that's pretty complicated. So at some point, you're going to have to decide what information they need right now. The corollary to this is what should be left out. You can absolutely tell children about how babies happen without telling them about anal sex, right? So the sex talk does not have to be comprehensive, especially when you're talking to like a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old. Which brings us to the third part, which is, what should you tell them when? And the truth is that I don't have the answer for that. The best advice that I can give you is that you should just answer the questions that they're prepared to ask. So if your children come to you with a specific question, answer the question honestly. If they don't ask, maybe just don't tell. So if you are at some point in a position to give the talk to a small child, just remember to be honest and to always answer their questions, because that means that they feel like they can trust you and they will continue to come to you when they have questions, which could end up being a great thing for you both. Another really common way for people to learn about sex is through their friends. And this, in some ways, is a really good way to learn about sex, because you can hear about people's different experiences, and you can learn things that your parents might not have told you. But sometimes this is a terrible way to learn about sex, because very often the kids have misinformation. You probably remember being told some crazy lie about sex when you were little, and in part this is because children are often desperate for information. Very often, the sex ed that we provide in the schools is lacking vital information, and also sometimes you don't have a talk with your parents, or information is not included in that talk. So often, the information that children learn from their own friends is incorrect, and so we do need to be careful about correcting anything like that. But it is still a very common way to find out new information and to see what your friends are doing. Sometimes this can go too far. Certain people mature at a faster level than other people. That's just sort of a fact of puberty and maturation. But what this means is that some kids might have more knowledge than other kids are prepared for. And also, sometimes kids have more knowledge than they are prepared for. It's, again, a pretty common occurrence now that we have the internet for people to find porn before they're ready to see porn. So this can be a pretty dangerous source of information, but it is a really common source. So again, if you have kids, make sure that you're telling them the truth so that they can tell other people the truth. The most common way that people learn about sex these days is through the media. And this is pretty reasonable. Americans spend most of their day looking at their screens, and children are no exception. So we're going to go through a couple different sources of media, but I wanted to clarify before we even start that we spend a lot of time absorbing media. And I'm not saying that you remember every single thing that you see, but it does sort of settle in your subconscious. So often our ideas about sex are sort of an amalgamation of everything that we have ever seen. And it's the process of our brain sorting through it to try to figure out what's normal, or what people like, or what people are doing. Because very often we don't receive that information directly, we have to kind of gather it from context clues. And again, these context clues typically come from the media that you're watching. So one thing to remember is that in America right now, we think kids are watching about 4 to 8 hours of TV, although this might have changed with quarantine. And they're also spending a lot of time on the computer, especially those who are attending online school. So it's possible that kids are spending as much as 6 to 9 hours a day on the computer. So that means if you're awake for 18 hours, you might be spending the vast majority of that looking at a screen of some kind. And I'm not here to tell you that that's wrong, but I am here to tell you that you are receiving a lot of information when you do this. And young people especially are receiving a lot of information when they spend that much time looking at screens. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is what information specifically they might be absorbing from all of this time. So let's start with TV. So a lot of the media for children doesn't contain any actual sex, but it does tend to contain a lot of messages about gender, especially messages about heterosexual relationships. And this is one of those things that kids sort of don't realize they're learning. If you watch these cartoons, you might sort of pick up on messages, for instance, about how women are supposed to behave, or how men are supposed to behave, or how courtship is supposed to look, or how marriage is supposed to look. And that's sort of the beginning part of how you're supposed to feel about sexual relationships. So one good thing is that the media that's designed for children has started to become a little bit more aware of its power, and it's starting to be a little bit more sort of politically correct, but also just a little bit more conscious of the power of women, of the power of men, and of treating people like people. For instance, you might be too young to remember Pepe Le Pew, the little skunk, but he used to have a whole series of cartoons in which he essentially sexually assaulted a cat. It's kind of a weird thing for cartoons, but he used to chase this cat around and try to hug her and try to kiss her, and it's weird to look back on it because that was giving children a pretty unfortunate message, but you'll notice that we don't make those cartoons anymore. Or similarly, if you follow the trajectory of Disney princesses, they progressively become more independent. The early Disney princesses were very much dependent on a prince to come rescue them. They were mostly just pretty and sang songs. But the latter-day princesses, especially the really modern princesses, are still pretty and sing songs, but they tend to take care of themselves. They tend to have a little bit more power and a little bit more agency. There's also some super progressive shows like Steven Universe, in which the characters are not even necessarily heterosexual. So the cartoons that we make for children have come a long way, but it's worth thinking about the kind of messages that you got from those about what was normal in a relationship, especially in a heterosexual relationship. So when we start to think about the shows that we make for slightly older children, for tweens, we start to see some different messaging. One thing that you'll always hear people talking about is that there's too much sex in the cartoons for children or in the shows for teens, and that's a hard line to draw. Very often we do see a little bit of sexuality, but it's sort of cut off at a certain point. So if you think about this show, Descendants, you might argue that their costumes are too sexy or something like that, but the characters are never necessarily in sexual situations. Usually what happens is that people watch shows about people who are a little bit older than them. So kids might watch shows about tweens, the tweens are watching shows about teenagers, the teenagers are watching shows about adults, and so on and so on. So basically, when people are watching shows, they're thinking about what will happen to them in the next couple of years when they become the age of the people on the shows. So the shows that are for tweens are often about teenagers. So sometimes they're getting good and positive messages, sometimes they're getting conflicting messages, and lately sometimes they're getting real information, like this cartoon which is about puberty. So the shows that are for tweens, again, used to be a little bit more sexualized than they even are today. What about the shows for teens, you ask? This one gets super sexy super fast. So this isn't necessarily unrealistic. The average age of virginity loss in America is 16. So it's possible that teenagers are having sex, but it's also possible that people who are in their early 20s are playing teenagers who are having more sex than any teenager has ever had. So it's worth thinking about how realistic this kind of thing is, but of course you don't know that when you're a teenager. So a lot of people have a really hard time when they actually are a teenager because they're pretty sure that everyone else is having more sex than them. And they're not. They're not. But everyone on TV is having a lot of sex, so it's a really, understandable issue to have. The shows that are made for teens these days are pretty sexy, but there is a question of whether people are getting good information, whether they're getting good role models, whether they're learning the kinds of things that we would like for them to learn about sex. So the top two shows for teens right now are Riverdale and Sabrina. Both shows about active modern teenagers, both shows with a little fantastical elements, and both shows which deal pretty openly with sexuality. What about adults, you ask? These are kind of the main shows for adults right now. Basically, every show for adults is going to contain a little bit of sexuality. Even the procedural dramas, like the shows where they solve crimes all day, contain a little bit of sexuality. Again, this is pretty normal. Americans just want to watch attractive people have sexual interactions with each other. So a lot of what we see on TV is, again, super sexual, perhaps more sexual than we would feel comfortable watching next to our mothers. But again, there's that question of whether we're learning anything good. Are we watching people have healthy relationships? Are we watching people get super competitive with other people? Are we watching people make mistakes and then learning from those mistakes? Or are we watching people make mistakes and then we go out and replicate those mistakes ourselves? So one of the things that we'll talk about, especially in your first paper, is what you learned from shows like this and what you thought would be normal for your life as an adult after watching shows like this. One thing that's really interesting to note about the sexuality of people on television is that we pretty much stop showing people being sexual when they get to a certain age. It's a whole thing. Basically, we know that men are essentially considered to be sexual in terms of male actors well into their 60s, but we almost never show older women having any sexual interaction at all. It's a whole social thing where essentially women just stop being sexual, basically when they hit about 40. So is this true? No. People continue to have sex well up until their retirement age, I promise. But it isn't something that we necessarily show on TV. So there's this question of why we don't show old people having sexual interactions or perhaps even dating, but it's something that we find super uncomfortable, so we tend to not show it on TV. The final thing about TVs that I wanted to talk about, or rather about TV shows, is the place of sexuality in modern politics. These days, it can be really hard to even turn on the news without finding a story about somebody having sex. Usually not a good story. Usually a story about someone cheating, or someone assaulting, or the president having multiple allegations of sexual assault. But this means that it can be tricky for you to watch the news with a young person. You may have experienced this before, where you're just simply watching a news broadcast early in the morning, but they start talking about a sexual assault scandal, and then a kid asks what sexual assault is. So the amount of time that we spend talking about sex on TV, whether we're showing it as part of shows or whether we're showing it as part of news, does continue to go up with every passing year, especially as Americans get more comfortable with our sexuality. But there is the question of whether this is good and healthy. And of course, there's always the question of what we're learning from the shows that we watch and from the shows that we might watch too early to really understand them. This is always the big question about sex and media. Another really kind of popular media that we learn a lot from is movies. Americans love movies. We make a lot of them, and we watch even more. So the first thing to consider is what children are learning in the movies that are specifically for them. And again, much like with TV, very often what they're learning is kind of unintentional. As they're watching these movies, they're learning a lot about how people are supposed to act according to their gender, about how people are supposed to act in terms of relationships. They might not necessarily know that things might turn sexual, but they do know that men are supposed to act a certain way and women are supposed to act a certain way, and in a sense they feel obligated to live up to that. We might also just be outright lying to children with movies. This movie, Storks, said that children were created in a factory and then delivered by storks, which is a weird choice. So another thing to pay attention to is where babies come from in the movies that are for children, because sometimes they just make it up. Another thing to think about with movies is the way that they're rated. So the rating system was designed so that people could tell if a movie would be appropriate for children or not. And there are a lot of problems with the rating system, including what they will show happening to men and what they will show happening to women and how they're different. But one thing to keep in mind is that most of the time the rating system is designed so that you know if a movie is appropriate for your kids. So it ranges all the way from G for general audience to NC-17, which means you really shouldn't watch it if you're under 17. But it's really interesting to think about what we consider appropriate for different age groups. Do we think it's appropriate for kids to watch kissing? What about nudity? What about frontal nudity? What about female versus male frontal nudity? It becomes a series of questions, and we tend to update these guidelines as we go, but they are still pretty restrictive. So one of the most important things to think about in terms of movies that are made for adults but watched by younger people is, again, what messages they're picking up from those movies. Are they learning good things? Are they learning negative things? And when is it appropriate for them to watch them? I'm sure we have all had the experience of sneaking around and watching a movie we weren't supposed to be watching, but can you remember what you learned from that movie? Or if you learned anything at all? Maybe it just flew straight over your head, because that often happens with messages that we're not prepared to hear because we don't understand the context. But maybe it sunk in and changed the way you thought about things forever. So the important thing about the parental guidelines is trying to decide what's appropriate for what age of person. And again, this is something we change our minds about all the time. One thing you may hear people talking about is that there's too much sex in the movies. And to be fair, people have been saying this since the 30s and the 20s when we started making movies, but it's kind of an interesting question. Because why do we always want there to be a romantic subplot? Why do we want the hero or heroine to end up with somebody in the end? And why is it always heterosexual? So one thing that's worth considering is that maybe we want to see this. Maybe we want a whole series of Nicholas Sparks books made into movies where white people almost but don't quite kiss. Or maybe we want to see a whole series of romantic comedies where two people who are at odds eventually decide they love each other and have sex. Maybe we make so many of these movies because we want to watch people have happy endings, because we so rarely see them in real life. It's a question worth asking, because very often we do wonder why an action movie needs a romantic subplot, and the possibility is that it's there because people will pay to watch it. Another thing worth considering is the sexualization of characters in movies, especially superhero characters. So there have been some really interesting studies where they analyze movie posters or where they analyze time spent in movies in regard to what's happening with the female characters and what's happening with the male characters. And one of the very famous examples that comes up over and over again is the sexualization of female action stars. So if, for instance, you look at this poster for Batman vs. Superman, you'll notice that Wonder Woman is in the front, but you'll also notice that she's way more naked than the other two. Does it help to have your arms and legs covered when you fight crime? I don't know, but maybe she should get a whole outfit. Or what about these other character posters for Captain America? You'll notice that they're both fully clothed, yet their poses are significantly different, their clothes are tight or not tight depending on their gender, and there has been a lot of talk about the way that they sexualize the Black Widow character in regard to that franchise. So one thing that I'd like for you to start paying attention to as you watch the movies that you would watch anyway is how sex is portrayed and whether it's portrayed differently for the differently gendered characters in the movie that you're watching. Another thing that's worth thinking about is the argument that perhaps we are changing our norms over the course of time. So for instance, the James Bond movies. They're a famous series, James Bond portrayed by different actors. In the olden days, James Bond used to have a lot of sex, all the time, with multiple women in the same movie. It was kind of part of his thing, like he was supposed to be a little bit of a sort of dirty scoundrel, yet still lovable. We were always supposed to be totally okay with this. There are no movies about women having sex with multiple men throughout the course of the movie where the woman is still the hero, but we used to have a whole series of James Bond movies about this. But you'll notice that in recent years, the last couple of James Bond movies have not had him having any sex at all with strangers. In fact, he had a serious monogamous love interest. In the poster for the latest movie, he's just alone. There's not a naked woman anywhere. So again, there might be an argument for the fact that the way that we sexualize things in movies is changing. Another source of information about sex is music. People have learned a lot of things about sex from music over the course of the years, and it wasn't always correct. So one of the things that I want to talk about when we talk about sex and music is lyrics. So again, here are some questions that I'd like for you to consider as you're kind of rolling this around in your brain and as you continue to listen to the music you were listening to anyway. So the first question is, when people sing about sex, what are they singing about? Are they singing about having sex? Wanting sex? Are they mad that they had sex? Are they mad they didn't have sex? Do they feel good about it? Is it respectful? Is it cool? These are always interesting questions to ask, because sometimes people are singing about sex, but the message is incredibly negative. But sometimes people are singing about sex, and the message is incredibly positive. And it doesn't necessarily change with genre. You tend to see both messages within the same genre all the time. Another question to consider is whether they're promoting a healthy sexuality. So again, sometimes we hear that certain genres are more negative than other genres, or more unhealthy, and that's an interesting question. Are the people promoting the kind of sex that they want to be having? Are they promoting the kind of sex they think people want to hear about? Sometimes people sing about sex even when they're not having sex. So the question becomes, is that healthy? Is that person okay? Are their listeners okay? And then of course, how does this change with gender? This is always a really interesting question, and I encourage you to think about your own music, the kind that you listen to, and to think about whether the messages about sex differ, whether the singer is male or female. Very often, we tend to see men singing more aggressive songs and women singing more passive songs, but again, that's not conclusive. So I encourage you to look through your own music and see what kind of messages are floating around in there. So next, let's talk about the kind of lyrics that we expect to come from people. So over the summer, you may have heard the song, WAP. I am not going to read you the lyrics to that song. I assume you've already heard it. If not, go look it up. But they got in a lot of trouble because the song was very sex positive, but it was also very graphic. So, predictably, a lot of messages came out about how they're ruining America, but keep in mind that people have been saying that since we founded America. Every couple generations, a singer comes out who is ruining America with all their talk about sex. People got real mad at Elvis back in the day. And this is another great example of that. Anytime that people start to talk about sex, there is the question of whether they should be allowed to, and whether it's appropriate, and whether they're gonna, ruin the children. We do, however, see this focus more carefully on women than on men. So you may also remember when the song Blurred Lines was the song of the summer a couple of years ago. And if you look at the lyrics to that song, you could argue that they're problematic. You could argue that the woman is being really sort of like objectified. You could also argue that she's being freed from social constraints. It's kind of a complex song. But one of the things, again, that I want you to pay attention to is the way that we treat women's songs and men's songs differently. One thing worth considering in regard to that is what we call essentially the position of power. So we talked about this especially in regard to conflict theory, but often with sexualization or with any sort of song that is about sex, it's important to consider whether the person who's singing is in a position of power over the person they're singing about. So for instance, it's kind of empowering if the person who is being looked at has more power than the person who is looking at them. However, it is not empowering if the person who is doing the looking has more power than the person who is being looked at. So for instance, a song where a wealthy, powerful man sings about what he wants to do to a less empowered, perhaps even less wealthy woman, probably not empowering. But a song where two people are the same age and the same social class, and perhaps the woman is singing about what she wants to do to the man, could be empowering. There are a lot of social factors here, including wealth, class, race, as always, but also gender is a major part of this. So as you're listening to the kind of songs that you listen to anyway, start to think about whether the song has an empowering message or whether the song has an objectifying message, and how that makes you feel and what you feel like you might be learning from that. It can be hard to do because very often the kind of music that we're listening to is personal to us, and we don't generally step back and think about it critically. But I would encourage you to try it, just to kind of see what messages you're getting without even knowing it. So another thing to consider when we think about music is the performance of the music. Just sitting there and listening to the song is one thing, but once there's a visual element involved, we start to get really weird with sexualization. So there are a couple of things worth considering when you think about the visual elements of the performance of music. So one, what changes? What changes when you can see the artist? Do you expect them to look a certain way? Do you expect them to dance a certain way? Do you expect them to dance at all? Do men and women perform differently? And do we expect them to perform differently? What about the dancing? What about the backup dancers? What do we expect when we look at an artist? And of course also, what about clothing? What do we expect people to wear when they're performing? And what do their outfits have to do with what they're trying to tell us and what they're trying to sell us and what they want us to think about them? So let's look at a couple of examples. Here on the left, we see the most famous pop group in the world, BTS. You may not have heard of them, but trust me, they're the most popular in the world right now. And this is a pretty typical performance outfit for them, but you'll notice that they are fully clothed, head to toe. They're wearing certainly special outfits, different colors, satin, they're very shiny, but they are still covered. Their outfits tend to be relatively modest. Whereas on the right, we see a series of pictures of women who are wearing kind of the same outfit for their stage performances. And this is part of a series about what we expect women to wear when they're performing, but you'll notice that this is pretty typical. Sparkles, short, fringe, we like to see the dancing. In this next slide, we see the top grossing tours of 2019. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the stage outfits that these artists are wearing. So first, on the left, Justin Timberlake. You'll notice that again, fully clothed, jacket, jeans, all that goodness. On the far right, Elton John, once again, fully clothed, although he does take a lot of interesting risks with his accessories. But in the middle, Pink. Now, Pink is famous for doing aerial work, which does require a certain kind of clothing. But it also means that out of these three artists, only one is a woman and she is nearly naked. That kind of thing is in no way unusual. We are used to seeing our female artist nearly naked, even though again that has nothing to do with singing, and often it has nothing to do with the song. As a final example, let's talk about backup dancers. You can of course have male dancers or female dancers or some mix of the two, but very often what we see is that the backup dancers are chosen based on the lead singer. So for instance, J-Lo used to dance with a whole series of half-naked men, but Rihanna dances with a whole series of half-naked women. So of course you can change it depending on your mood and the song and the tour, but one of the things that backup dancers do is provide a sort of affirmation for the singer. Very often they're sort of standing around them, they're all similarly dressed, and they exist as a sort of reflection of what the singer wants you to see. So remember to pay attention to the background dancers and what their role is and what they think that you should think when you look at them, because there's a lot of dramaturgy involved in this whole sort of thing. Perhaps the most common way that modern young people learn about sex is pornography. And this is a shame, because very often it's hugely inaccurate and you're learning all sorts of wrong things. But let's talk about it. So the first question becomes, how old should you be to start watching pornography? And the websites are very clear, you should be 18. Sometimes they make you press the button that says you're 18, which I don't know why they think people can't press it, but whatever, it's a legal hurdle that you have to jump over. So the question becomes, are people watching porn when they're really too young to be watching porn? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of really terrible porn out there. There's a lot of good porn out there too, of course, but you have to dig for it and sometimes you have to pay for it. So the vast majority of what people are watching for free that is readily accessible is terrible and contains terrible messages, and it's kind of a problem. So when you see that sort of thing, when you're really very young, it can build your expectations in terms of what sex will be like and what you can expect from your partners. And the problem with this is that we are usually not learning good things. For one thing, the bodies are totally unusual. We talked a little bit in the sex ed lecture about how the penises are pretty excessive and unlike anything you're likely to see in the wild. But also we're going through a phase where everybody's really hairless. In previous decades, porn featured a lot of body hair, but currently no one has any hair. The women are orgasming just constantly and repeatedly from vaginal penetration alone, which is not a thing. The men last for 45 minutes at a time. The whole thing is really incredibly unrealistic. But the problem is that if you don't know it's unrealistic, because you are 11, you will start to build your expectations for what your future sex life will be. And then, unavoidably, you will be horrified and disappointed. I've talked to a lot of young men who have said that they were really surprised the first time that they had sex with an actual live human because, for instance, they didn't know that there would be smells or sounds or hair. Basically, if that's the only thing you've ever seen in regard to sexuality, you're starting off from kind of a weird place. So this is something that's very difficult to overcome, what you thought was normal from watching porn and what you find out to be normal when you start being sexually active in your real life. Another thing worth talking about is that there can be some negative effects from watching porn. Like almost anything else that gives us dopamine, it can be addictive. And this doesn't mean that it's addictive like a substance is addictive. It would be more accurate to say that it's habit forming. Typically, when you watch pornography, especially if you orgasm, you get all sorts of really good brain chemicals. And what you want is to have those brain chemicals again. So you watch more pornography to get more brain chemicals. But the problem is that it isn't always exciting the next time. So you have to watch something that's a little bit more exciting. So things become more graphic, or sometimes they become more violent, or sometimes they become weirder in order for you to get that same initial pleasure. So it can build itself into kind of a spiral, which has no good exit. So a lot of people end up having to stop watching porn entirely just to kind of retrain their brain to be excited by normal stimuli. A more common and probably more understandable problem is that sometimes people's partners get insulted by their partner watching porn. Sometimes people feel like it's a rejection of them, or they feel like their body must not be good enough, or they might not be exciting enough, and usually this is not the case. Usually it's just that porn is fun and sex is fun. But this is something that's important to talk to your partners about. A lot of people find success watching porn together. So if this is something that's interesting to you, it's always best to use your words. Because again, a lot of the porn that's out there is terrible, and we don't want anybody thinking that that's normal or that's something that they should be doing. But if there is something specific that you want to do or something specific that you want to watch, gotta use your words. Gotta talk to your partner about what you want to see and what you want to do. So pornography can be harmful, but it isn't always harmful, and I would never tell you not to watch it. But you do have to be mindful of whether you're watching it at the expense of your real relationship, and whether what you're watching changes your ideas about what you want out of your sex life. The final thing for us to talk about is sex ed in America. So like I said in the beginning of the sex ed video, one of the reasons that I like to start the whole semester with sex ed is because I have no way of knowing what you learned before. And if you had sex ed in America, especially if you had sex ed in the South, you probably learned something terrible. So let's talk about why we teach kids what we teach them in sex ed, and why so often the message is this one: if you have sex, you're going to get pregnant and die. So let's start with our early American efforts. So basically in the 1800s, we started really moving into cities, and that's when we started feeling responsible for like children as a whole. So prior to this, Americans were mostly pretty spread out on farms and that sort of thing. Sex education was handled by the parents, maybe a little bit the church. But as people started to move into cities, we started to have public education for children, and that included public education about sex. So we started with like a really clear focus on like cleanliness and morality. The first couple of associations had excellent names, like the American Society of Sanitary and Moral Prophylaxis, what a title, or the American Federation for Sex Hygiene. And of course, when they said things like hygiene or moral, there was a little bit of eugenics involved. That's going to be a whole theme. And also they were talking about STIs at least a little bit, and also they were talking about prostitution. So for a large part, sex education in those days had to do with trying to get young people to not have sex with prostitutes and to keep themselves as clean as possible. The next level of sex education was more about families. So they kept the whole idea of being clean and being proper, focusing on like facts that we had at the time, but they also started to talk about building a future family. So in programs like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, 4-H, the YMCA, they had classes about things like sexual cleanliness, but also about things like parenting and about physical well-being as a whole. So there was definitely still this focus on morality, but it was starting to sort of edge its way into an acknowledgement that eventually you would have sex and they wanted you to do it safely. The next phase was basically during the mid-1900s. And one of the things that really changed here was the change in technology. So essentially we invented the film strip. And I'll put one up for you to watch because they're amazing. But basically the film strips were a really useful tool. because this meant that the adult in the classroom didn't have to talk to you directly anymore. They could just put on a movie. But it also meant that a lot of people were receiving exactly the same education. There was sort of a standardization in terms of what information we gave young people and what we wanted them to learn from it. And sometimes standardization is great. So the movies in the mid-60s, and especially the ones that they produced on into the 70s, had a lot of focus on morality, but there was an increased level of scientific awareness. We had learned more about the human body as we went. And we also started to see a little bit of acknowledgement that maybe women would have sex too, but only a little bit. So as we get on into the 80s and 90s and really into the 2000s, we start to see a resurgence in the concept of abstinence in sex education. So basically, abstinence is the complete refraining from sex of any kind. And in previous generations, we had taught students assuming that there would be some sort of sexual activity, but now we start to see a lot of people pushing for us to teach only abstinence in the schools. And usually this is based around two different issues, and one is funding. How much should we pay for sex education, especially when we disagree with the messages? But also morality, and of course religion. Should we tell kids about sex if we don't expect them to have sex until they're married? So let's look at the two different kinds of education and talk a little bit about both. So first, of course, we have abstinence-only sex education. And the basic premise here is that you should abstain from any kind of sex with anybody until marriage. And this does, of course, assume heterosexual marriage. The basis of abstinence-only sex education assumes that you will become married and assumes that that marriage will be heterosexual in nature. The idea with abstinence-only education is that we don't need to tell children about sex, because if they just abstain, then they won't get pregnant and they won't get STIs. Which technically is true, except of course in cases of sexual assault, but basically with abstinence-only education, they're saying that we shouldn't tell children anything about sex because teaching them about sex is what will lead to our downfall. The other argument is for comprehensive sex education. And comprehensive sex education argues that we should give children the facts, that we should always tell them the truth. Also, that they should be allowed to ask questions. Very often with abstinence-only sex educations, the educators are not allowed to answer certain questions, even if the students ask. And also, that we should explain birth control. Very often, with abstinence-only sex education, birth control is not mentioned, or if it is mentioned, sometimes they outright lie about the effectiveness of birth control, which is downright bad if you ask me. But with comprehensive sex education, one of the arguments is that birth control should be explained, its effectiveness should be explained, and the ways to use it should be explained. So, this is an ongoing argument. So if we look at some of the arguments sort of for and against comprehensive sex ed, it does get really complex. And sometimes it does get really personal. So a lot of people argue, for instance, that arming children with accurate information about their bodies is the fairest thing to do. And that giving them access to this kind of information and access to birth control and other ways to protect themselves is the best way that we can aid our children in the future. But other people argue that the place to discuss sexuality is in the home. That educators who don't even know our children shouldn't be telling them about things that are deeply personal. Or that no one should be having sex outside of marriage, so we shouldn't act as though it's normal. Some people believe that if you talk about sex with children, you're implicitly giving them permission to have sex, whereas if you never talk about sex, it won't occur to them to have sex. Other people believe that the place to discuss sexuality is only in the home, and discussing it outside of the home is sort of gross and questionable. So this gets really tricky, as you can imagine. And again, it does have a lot to do with the morality in the place where you live, with religion in the place where you live. But the argument between abstinence only and comprehensive sex education is one that's ongoing. So for instance, let's look at how much we spend. In this graph, you can see that the amount of money that we spend on sex education varies hugely. In orange, we're looking at money spent on abstinence only, and in blue, we're looking at money spent on comprehensive. And the thing that should stick out to you when you look at this is who is in charge, depending on which president is in charge and what they want to spend money on. So you'll notice, for instance, that Bush Jr. spent a lot of money on abstinence only, whereas Obama cut the money for abstinence only and spent a lot of money on comprehensive sex education. So what you decide to teach does have a lot to do with whether you're conservative values or liberal values or what. The next thing to consider is that it changes based on where you are. So the thing is that each state gets to decide their own rules about sex education. There are federal guidelines, but the truth is the state guidelines are what control what the kids are taught in the schools. So this graph is a little bit confusing, but basically the places in pink are where sex education is mandatory. The places in blue are where it's mandatory to mention HIV and AIDS. The places in red are where you have to talk about both. The places in gray are where there is no clear curriculum. And any place with a white stripe argues that you need to stress abstinence only. So you may notice here, for instance, that in the so-called Bible Belt, we see a lot of focus on abstinence only, but we don't necessarily see a lot of focus on HIV. You might notice in what we call the liberal elite states, the coastal states, there isn't a lot of focus on abstinence, but there is a lot of focus on things like HIV. Where this gets interesting is what happens to people after school. So for instance, if you are the kind of person who had an abstinence-only sex education, there might be lasting problems for you for the rest of your life. Because the problem with abstinence-only sex education is that teenagers are going to have sex anyway. They always have. They always will. This is not something that we can control. If you ask your parents if they thought people were having sex in high school, they were. If you ask your grandparents, they were. Their parents, they were. I know it's gross to think about, but trust me, people have always had sex as teenagers, and they are always going to, and it doesn't matter what you tell them. The problem is that if you tell them nothing about contraceptives, they won't use contraceptives. So what we end up seeing is that people who have abstinence-only sex education are much more likely to experience unintended pregnancies and much more likely to experience infections. So essentially, if you don't prepare people for using protection when they do become sexually active, they experience negative consequences. But it's not just the pregnancy, is it? If you get pregnant, very often you have a baby. And what happens is that the unwed teenage mothers typically have to drop out of school, which means they're not able to finish their education and they're not able to get good paying jobs, and they and their child might live in poverty for the rest of their lives. The unwed teenage fathers, on the other hand, usually just continue in school. It's a huge gender disparity in what happens, even though it does take both people to get pregnant. We also tend to see that if you get pregnant young and raise your child in poverty, you start a cycle. Because often what happens is that you get pregnant, you have that child young, you never get a very good job, so you live in kind of a terrible neighborhood, which means your child goes to kind of a terrible school where they've received terrible sex education, and then they get pregnant young, and then they stay impoverished, and then they stay in a bad neighborhood, and then they stay in a bad school, and then they get pregnant young, and it just goes and goes and goes that way. That cycle can repeat itself every 15 years. So one of the things that is really important to think about when we think about sex education is what the lasting impacts are. So we're going to look at one more map. And this map is pretty complex. But basically, what I want you to think about is that the darker blue the state is, the higher the rate of teenage birth. So essentially not just pregnancy, but teenage girls giving birth. The states where the hash marks go to the left are places where they had abstinence-only education. And the states where the hash marks go to the right are places where the median household income is below 45, which is definitely below poverty. So one of the things that you'll notice is that it often occurs together, that people have abstinence-only education and get pregnant, and that people have abstinence-only education, get pregnant, and live in poverty. So the point that I'm trying to make with this map is that these things are not unrelated. They are direct consequences of each other. If you have abstinence-only sex education, you accidentally get pregnant, and you live in poverty, that might be caused by factors that are sort of outside of your control. So the important thing to remember about sex education is that there are a lot of arguments for doing it one way or the other way, but you do have to consider the lasting impacts of what you choose. So, that wraps up our talk about learning about sex. I hope you had some interesting flashbacks to your own learning experience. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email, and I'll see you next time.